The morning fog hung thick over Windsor Castle as Captain Thomas Mitchell adjusted his ceremonial uniform for what he believed would be his final day of service. After 32 years protecting the royal family, retirement beckoned like a distant shore. The weight of countless secrets pressed against his chest, but none heavier than the one he had carried for over 2 decades. Thomas had seen 3 generations of royals pass through these ancient halls. He had stood guard during state dinners, royal weddings, and moments of private grief that the public would never witness. But there was one secret that had eaten away at him like acid on stone, growing more unbearable with each passing year. The old queen had passed away 6 months ago, and with her death came a flood of memories Thomas had tried desperately to suppress. He remembered that rainy October evening in 1998, when everything changed. The queen had summoned him to her private study, something that had never happened before in his years of service. "Captain Mitchell," she had said, her voice trembling with an emotion he had never heard before, "I need to ask something of you that goes beyond your sworn duty. I need to ask you to keep a secret that could shake the very foundations of this monarchy." The queen's hands had shaken as she poured herself a cup of tea, the delicate china rattling against the saucer. Thomas had stood at attention, every muscle in his body tense with anticipation. In all his years of service, he had never seen Her Majesty look so vulnerable, so human. 23 years ago, before my son Charles married Diana, there was another woman, the Queen continued, her eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window. A woman he loved deeply, but whom he could never marry due to circumstances beyond their control. Her name was Sarah Whitmore, and she was a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital. Thomas felt his throat tighten. He knew where this conversation was heading, and the implications terrified him. Royal scandals had destroyed careers, toppled governments, and changed the course of history. But this felt different. This felt bigger. The Queen turned to face him, and Thomas saw tears glistening in her eyes. "Sarah gave birth to a son in March 1979, Charles's son, my grandson." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. "We made arrangements for the child to be raised away from the public eye, away from the pressures and dangers of royal life. But now, with everything that has happened, with Diana's death and the chaos that followed, I fear we may have made a terrible mistake." Thomas remembered how his knees had nearly buckled. A secret heir to the throne, a hidden prince who had lived his entire life unaware of his true heritage. The weight of this knowledge settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket. "The boy's name is Alexander," the Queen continued. "Alexander Whitmore. He's 19 now, studying medicine at Oxford University, following in his mother's footsteps. He's brilliant, kind, and everything a future king should be, but he doesn't know. His mother and I agreed it was better that way. Sarah Whitmore had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, taking her secret to the grave. The only people who knew the truth were the Queen, her private secretary who had since passed away, and now Thomas. The burden of this knowledge had nearly driven the Queen to madness, she confessed. She had watched from afar as Alexander grew into a remarkable young man, excelling in his studies and showing the kind of compassion and leadership that royalty desperately needed. "But Charles has the right to know he has another son," the Queen said, her voice breaking. "And Alexander has the right to know who he really is. I'm getting old, Captain Mitchell. My time is running out, and I cannot take this secret with me to the grave. Someone else must carry this burden." Thomas had accepted the responsibility without hesitation, swearing on his honor as a soldier and his loyalty to the crown that he would protect this secret until the Queen decided what to do with it. But years passed, and the Queen never spoke of it again. Charles married Camilla. William and Harry grew into their roles as future kings, and Alexander continued his life as an ordinary citizen, completely unaware that royal blood flowed through his veins. The weight of the secret had grown heavier with each passing year. Thomas had watched Alexander from afar, following his career as he became one of London's most respected emergency room doctors. He had seen him volunteer at homeless shelters, work with children's charities, and dedicate his life to helping others. Everything about Alexander screamed royalty, from his natural leadership abilities to his unwavering commitment to service. But the Queen had made Thomas promise to never reveal the truth unless she specifically asked him to do so. And she never did. Even on her deathbed, surrounded by family and closest advisors, she had remained silent about Alexander's existence. Some secrets, it seemed, were meant to die with their keepers. Now, as Thomas prepared to leave the castle for the final time, the weight of that promise felt crushing. Alexander was 36 years old, still unmarried but in a serious relationship with a fellow doctor named Emma. He had no idea that he was actually third in line to the throne, ahead of many of the royals who regularly appeared on magazine covers and television screens. Thomas packed his belongings slowly, each item triggering another memory of his years in service. The medal the Queen had personally pinned to his chest after he had saved Prince William from a would-be kidnapper in 1995. The photograph of him standing guard during Prince Harry's wedding, his face stoic but his heart swelling with pride. The handwritten thank you note from Princess Diana after he had helped coordinate security for her charity work. But it was the small, sealed envelope hidden in his desk drawer that made his hands tremble. Inside was a letter the Queen had written to Alexander, explaining everything. She had given it to Thomas 3 years before her death, with instructions to deliver it only if something happened to her, and the secret became too dangerous to keep. The monarchy needs fresh blood, she had whispered to him during one of their final conversations. It needs someone who understands what it means to serve without expecting anything in return. Alexander is that person, but the decision of whether or not to claim his birthright must be his alone. As Thomas walked through the castle corridors one final time, he made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow he would knock on Alexander's door and deliver the letter that would reveal the truth about his parentage. The secret that had haunted 3 decades would finally see the light of day, and nothing would ever be the same again. Dr. Alexander Whitmore checked his watch as he finished his rounds at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Another 14-hour shift was finally coming to an end, and exhaustion tugged at every muscle in his body. At 36, he had already established himself as one of London's most dedicated emergency physicians, known for his calm demeanor during crisis situations and his unwavering commitment to his patients. The irony wasn't lost on him that he worked at the same hospital where his mother had once served as a nurse. Sarah Whitmore had been his hero, raising him as a single parent after his father had supposedly died in a military accident when Alexander was just an infant. She had instilled in him the values of service, compassion, and integrity that had shaped his entire life. Alexander's modest flat in Bloomsbury reflected his simple lifestyle. Despite earning a substantial salary as a senior consultant, he lived frugally, donating most of his earnings to various charities. The walls were lined with medical journals, photographs from his volunteer work in Africa, and a few precious pictures of his mother. There were no expensive paintings or designer furniture, just functional pieces that served their purpose. As he climbed the stairs to his third-floor apartment, Alexander noticed an elderly man in a dark coat standing near his door. The stranger appeared nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot while clutching a manila envelope against his chest. Something about the man's military bearing and the way he carried himself suggested authority, but there was also an unmistakable sadness in his weathered features. "Dr. Whitmore," the man asked, his voice carrying a slight tremor. "My name is Captain Thomas Mitchell. I served as a royal guard for 32 years. I retired yesterday and I have something that belongs to you." Alexander frowned, key halfway to the lock. "I'm sorry, but I think you have the wrong person. I don't have any connection to the royal family, and I certainly don't own anything that would have been in their possession." Thomas's hands shook as he held out the envelope. "Dr. Whitmore, your mother was Sarah Whitmore, correct? She worked as a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital and died in a car accident in 2007. The mention of his mother's death still sent a sharp pain through Alexander's chest. Even after all these years, the loss felt fresh, like a wound that refused to heal properly. "Yes, that's correct. But I still don't understand what this has to do with the royal family. May I come in?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What I have to tell you will change your life forever, and it's not something that should be discussed in a hallway." Against his better judgment, Alexander opened the door and gestured for Thomas to enter. The old guard moved slowly, as if each step carried the weight of decades. He declined the offer of tea, instead sitting heavily in the worn armchair near the window, the envelope still clutched in his arthritic hands. "Before I give this to you," Thomas began, "I need you to understand that your life will never be the same once you open it. You have a choice here, Dr. Whitmore. You can ask me to leave and you can continue living the life you've built. Or you can open this envelope and discover a truth that your mother and the late queen took great pains to hide. Alexander felt his heart rate increase. Nothing in his predictable, orderly life had prepared him for this moment. The late queen? What did she have to do with my mother? Thomas closed his eyes, and for a moment Alexander thought the old man might be having some sort of medical episode. But then Thomas opened his eyes, and the pain Alexander saw there was emotional, not physical. Your mother loved a man she could never marry, Thomas said slowly. A man whose duty to his country and his future role made their relationship impossible. But love doesn't always follow the rules of society, and sometimes it creates consequences that echo through decades. The envelope seemed to pulse with hidden energy as Thomas held it out. This letter was written by Queen Elizabeth herself, 3 years before her death. She gave it to me with specific instructions. If she passed away without revealing the truth, I was to deliver it to you personally. Alexander stared at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. His rational, scientific mind rebelled against the implications of what Thomas was suggesting. Royal conspiracies belonged in tabloids and television dramas, not in the real world of a middle-class doctor who had never even been inside Buckingham Palace. But something deep in his gut told him that Thomas was telling the truth. There had always been gaps in his mother's stories about his father. She had been vague about the details of their relationship, claiming that the memories were too painful to share. Whenever Alexander had pressed for information, Sarah had changed the subject or dissolved into tears. Who was he? Alexander asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Prince Charles, Thomas replied, his voice barely audible. The man who is now King Charles III is your biological father. The words hit Alexander like a physical blow. He stumbled backward, gripping the edge of his kitchen counter for support. The room seemed to spin around him, and he felt like he might be sick. Everything he had believed about his identity, his family, his place in the world, crumbled in an instant. That's impossible, he whispered. My mother would have told me. She wouldn't have kept something like that secret. Thomas's expression was infinitely sad. Your mother kept it secret to protect you. The royal family in the late 1970s was very different from today. A child born out of wedlock to the heir to the throne would have been seen as a scandal that could destroy the monarchy. Your mother loved you too much to subject you to that kind of scrutiny and pressure. Alexander sank into his sofa, his mind reeling. Suddenly, dozens of small mysteries from his childhood began to make sense. The expensive medical textbooks that had appeared anonymously on his birthday each year. The full scholarship to Oxford that he had never applied for but had been awarded anyway. The trust fund that had paid for his medical education, which his mother had claimed came from a distant relative he had never met. How many people know? He asked. Until today, only 3 people knew the truth. Your mother, the late queen, and myself. Your mother is gone, the queen has passed away, and I've now told you. As far as I know, King Charles himself has never been informed that he has another son. The implications of this revelation crashed over Alexander in waves. If what Thomas was saying was true, he wasn't just some ordinary doctor from London. He was a prince. He was third in line to the throne, ahead of all the minor royals whose faces appeared regularly in the media. He had royal blood flowing through his veins, connecting him to centuries of British history. But more than that, he had been living a lie his entire life. Every birthday, every Christmas, every moment of triumph and failure had been built on a foundation of deception. His mother, whom he had idolized for her honesty and integrity, had been keeping the biggest secret imaginable. The letter will explain everything, Thomas said, standing to leave. The Queen's private secretary conducted DNA tests when you were a child. The results are in there, along with photographs, documents, and a complete explanation of the arrangements that were made for your care. Alexander stared at the envelope, afraid to touch it. What happens now? What am I supposed to do with this information? Thomas paused at the door. That's entirely up to you, Dr. Whitmore. You can destroy the letter and continue your life as it is. You can contact the royal family and claim your birthright, or you can simply live with the knowledge and make whatever choices feel right to you. But I will warn you of this. Secrets this big have a way of coming out eventually. The question is whether you want to control how and when that happens. After Thomas left, Alexander sat alone in his flat, staring at the envelope that contained the truth about his heritage. Outside, London continued its evening rhythm, unaware that one of its citizens had just discovered he was secretly a prince. The letter felt heavy in his hands, weighted with the power to change not just his life, but potentially the entire course of the British monarchy. Alexander spent 3 sleepless nights staring at the sealed envelope before finally finding the courage to open it. The breaking of the royal seal felt like crossing a bridge that could never be rebuilt. Inside, he found documents that would have seemed impossible if they hadn't been written in the unmistakable handwriting of the late Queen herself. The letter began with an apology that stretched across 2 pages. Queen Elizabeth had written about the impossible position she had found herself in when Charles confessed his love for Sarah Whitmore in 1978. Charles had been 29, already under tremendous pressure to find a suitable wife and secure the succession. Sarah had been 25, a commoner with no title or fortune, but possessing something far more valuable, Charles's complete and absolute love. "My dear Alexander," the Queen had written, "by the time you read this letter I will be gone, and the burden of this secret will no longer be mine to bear. I want you to know that every decision made regarding your birth and upbringing was made with love, though I understand it may not feel that way to you now." The letter explained how Charles and Sarah had conducted their relationship in secret for nearly 2 years. They had met when Charles had been treated at St. Mary's Hospital after a polo accident, and Sarah had been assigned as his private nurse during his recovery. What had begun as professional care had blossomed into a deep emotional connection that neither of them could resist. "Your father spoke of Sarah with a light in his eyes that I had never seen before," the Queen continued. "He would spend hours describing her kindness to patients, her intelligence, her ability to make him laugh even in his darkest moments. For the first time in his life, Charles felt like he could be himself rather than simply the heir to the throne. But their love affair had been discovered by the Queen's private secretary in early 1979. Just as Sarah realized she was pregnant, the political implications had been immediate and terrifying. Britain was still recovering from economic crisis. The royal family's popularity was at a low point, and any scandal involving the heir to the throne could have triggered a constitutional crisis. The documents included photographs that made Alexander's hands tremble. There was Charles looking impossibly young and happy, his arm around a woman who was unmistakably Alexander's mother. Sarah's smile was radiant, her hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach. In another photo, Charles was kneeling beside Sarah in what appeared to be a hospital garden, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. But the most shocking photograph showed Charles holding a newborn baby. The timestamp read March 15, 1979, Alexander's birthday. His father's face was filled with a mixture of joy and heartbreak that was almost painful to witness. Charles had been there for his birth, had held his son, had known from the very beginning that he existed. The Queen's letter explained the arrangement that had been made with Sarah. She would raise Alexander as a single mother, with financial support provided through an anonymous trust fund. Charles would have no official contact with his son, but he would be kept informed about Alexander's progress through reports from the Queen's private secretary. In exchange, Sarah would never reveal the identity of Alexander's father, and she would discourage any attempts by Alexander to seek out his paternal family. "Your mother was offered a substantial sum to move to another country and start fresh," the letter continued, "but she refused to leave England. She wanted you to grow up British," she said, "with all the advantages that British citizenship could provide. She was thinking of your future even then, though she couldn't have known what that future might hold." The trust fund had been larger than Alexander could have imagined. The documents showed payments for his education, medical expenses, and living costs that totaled well over £2 million across his lifetime. There had also been gifts that Alexander now realized weren't gifts at all: the medical scholarship to Oxford, the deposit for his first apartment, the money that had appeared in his account whenever he faced financial difficulties. Even more shocking was the revelation that his mother had continued to see Charles throughout Alexander's childhood, though always in secret, and always with the understanding that their relationship could never be acknowledged publicly. The Queen's letter included excerpts from reports she had received about these meetings. Charles treasures every photograph, every school report, every small detail about Alexander's progress, one report read. He keeps them in a private safe in his study and reviews them regularly. When Alexander won the medical school prize for outstanding service to the community, Charles wept with pride. Alexander discovered that his father had been present, though carefully hidden. at several important moments in his life. Charles had watched from a distance when Alexander graduated from Oxford. He had been in the hospital waiting room when Alexander had his appendix removed at age 16. He had even attended some of Alexander's rugby matches during university, sitting in the back rows wearing a cap and sunglasses. The most emotional document was a letter that Charles had written to Alexander on his 18th birthday, but had never sent. In it, he expressed his pride in the young man Alexander had become, and his regret that they couldn't have a relationship. "I think about you every day," Charles had written. "I wonder what your voice sounds like, whether you have my laugh, if you inherited your mother's compassion or my stubbornness. I hope that someday when the circumstances are right, we might meet as father and son rather than as strangers." But what disturbed Alexander most was learning how much his mother had sacrificed for this secret. Sarah had never married, despite several serious relationships, because she felt it would be unfair to any man to enter into marriage while keeping such a monumental secret. She had turned down job opportunities in other countries because she wanted to stay close to Charles. Even though they could rarely see each other, she had lived her entire adult life carrying the burden of loving a man she could never fully have. The letter concluded with the Queen's reasoning for finally revealing the truth. "The monarchy is changing, Alexander. The rigid rules that made your parents' love impossible are slowly giving way to a more modern understanding of duty and personal happiness. Your brother William married for love, as did your brother Harry. The time may come when the British people are ready to accept that their king once loved deeply and created a son who embodies all the best qualities of royalty without any of its pretensions." The final paragraph was a personal plea. "You have spent your entire life serving others without thought of personal gain or recognition. You have shown more true nobility in your work as a doctor than many who were born to titles. The throne needs someone like you, Alexander. But more than that, your father needs to know that his son forgives him for the choices he was forced to make." Along with the letter were legal documents proving Alexander's parentage, including DNA test results from hair samples taken during his childhood medical exams. There were also photographs, birth certificates, and even a family tree showing exactly where Alexander fit in the line of succession. As Alexander sat surrounded by the debris of his former life, he realized that Thomas had been right. Nothing would ever be the same. The quiet, purposeful existence he had built as Dr. Alexander Whitmore was gone forever. In its place was something far more complicated and potentially dangerous. He was no longer just a doctor who happened to help people. He was a prince who had chosen to become a doctor. He wasn't just Sarah Whitmore's son who had lost his mother tragically young. He was King Charles's secret son who had been hidden from the world for over 3 decades. Every choice he made from this moment forward would carry weight far beyond his own personal happiness. The question that haunted him as dawn broke over London was simple, but profound. What was he going to do with this knowledge? The crown that he had never wanted was now within his reach, but claiming it would mean destroying the carefully constructed life he had built and potentially causing a scandal that could damage the monarchy itself. But perhaps most importantly, it would mean confronting a father who had loved him from a distance for 36 years and deciding whether forgiveness was possible after a lifetime of necessary deception. Emma Richardson knew something was wrong the moment Alexander walked into the hospital cafeteria. They had been together for 3 years, and she could read his moods like a medical chart. The man sitting across from her bore little resemblance to the confident, composed doctor she had fallen in love with. His hands shook slightly as he stirred his coffee, and his usually bright eyes seemed haunted by something she couldn't identify. "You look like you haven't slept in a week," Emma said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "What's going on, Alex? You've been acting strange ever since that elderly man came to see you." Alexander stared into his coffee cup, as if it held the answers to questions he was afraid to ask. How could he possibly explain to the woman he loved that he had just discovered he was a prince? That the life they had been planning together might be impossible because of a secret that had been kept for over 3 decades? "Emma," he began slowly, "what would you say if I told you that everything I thought I knew about my family was a lie?" She squeezed his hand gently. "I'd say that families are complicated, and sometimes we discover things that change how we see our past. But whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." The word "together" sent a sharp pain through Alexander's chest. He had spent the past week researching everything he could about royal protocols, succession laws, and the expectations placed on members of the royal family. If he chose to acknowledge his heritage, Emma would be thrust into a spotlight that could destroy her career and her privacy. She would become tabloid fodder, scrutinized and judged for every choice she had ever made. "What if I told you that my father isn't dead?" Alexander continued. "What if I told you that he's actually very much alive, very famous, and that his identity would change everything about our future?" Emma frowned, her medical instincts kicking in. "Alex, you're scaring me. Are you having some sort of breakdown? Because if you are, we can get you help. There's no shame in needing support." Alexander pulled out the manila envelope he had been carrying everywhere for the past week. The documents inside had been photocopied and stored in a safety deposit box, but the originals remained with him like a physical weight he couldn't put down. "I need you to read something," he said. "But before you do, I need you to promise me that you'll think carefully about what this means for us. For your career, your privacy, your entire life." Emma took the envelope with the same careful attention she gave to medical records. As she read the Queen's letter, Alexander watched her expression change from confusion to shock to something approaching disbelief. When she reached the photographs, her hands began to tremble just as his had. "This is impossible," she whispered. "This can't be real." "I had the same reaction," Alexander said. "I've spent the past week trying to convince myself it was some elaborate hoax, but everything checks out. The DNA results, the legal documents, even the financial records showing payments from the Royal Trust Fund throughout my childhood." Emma stared at a photograph of Charles holding newborn Alexander. "You look just like him," she murmured. "I can't believe I never noticed the resemblance before. The same jawline, the same eyes." She looked up at Alexander with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You're really a prince?" "Technically, yes. Third in line to the throne according to the succession documents. Ahead of Princess Anne, ahead of Prince Edward, ahead of all the minor royals who appear on magazine covers." Alexander laughed bitterly. "I've been living in a tiny flat and donating most of my salary to charity while I'm apparently worth hundreds of millions of pounds." Emma set down the documents carefully. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," Alexander admitted. "Part of me wants to burn everything and pretend this never happened. Go back to our quiet life. Get married next year like we planned. Maybe have children who never have to deal with any of this. And the other part?" Alexander was quiet for a long moment. "The other part keeps thinking about what my mother went through. She loved someone she could never have. Sacrificed everything for a secret she couldn't share. And my father. He's carried this burden for 36 years. Maybe it's time for the truth to finally come out." Emma stood up and began pacing, her mind racing through the implications. "If you acknowledge who you are, everything changes. The media attention would be insane. I'd have photographers following me to work, reporters digging through my past, speculation about every aspect of our relationship." "I know," Alexander said quietly. "That's why I can't ask you to stay with me through this. It wouldn't be fair." Emma stopped pacing and stared at him. "Are you breaking up with me?" "I'm giving you a choice," Alexander replied. "You can walk away now before this gets complicated. Find someone normal who can give you the peaceful life you deserve. Or you can stay and deal with whatever chaos comes from revealing that the King of England has a secret son." "And what do you want me to choose?" Alexander's voice broke slightly. "I want you to choose me. But I love you too much to ask you to sacrifice your entire life for a secret that isn't even yours to bear." Emma sat back down and took his hands in hers. "Alex, do you remember what you told me on our first date? You said that the most important thing in life was finding something worth fighting for. Well, I found something worth fighting for 3 years ago, and it wasn't the quiet life or the peaceful existence. It was you." "This is different, Emma. This is bigger than anything we've faced before." "Maybe," she said. "But you're still the same man who works 16-hour shifts to help people. You're still the doctor who volunteers at homeless shelters on his days off. You're still the person who cries during sad movies and makes terrible jokes when you're nervous. Finding out that your father is the king doesn't change who you are at your core. Alexander felt tears building in his eyes. What if I decide to claim my heritage? What if I decide that I want to be a prince? Emma smiled for the first time since she had started reading the documents. Then I guess I'll have to learn how to curtsy properly. Their conversation was interrupted by Alexander's pager buzzing with an emergency code. As they rushed back to the emergency department, Alexander realized that this might be one of his last shifts as simply Dr. Alexander Whitmore. Whether he acknowledged his royal heritage or not, the knowledge would change everything about how he saw himself and his place in the world. The emergency was a multi-car accident with several critical patients. As Alexander worked to save lives, using skills he had developed over years of training and dedication, he realized something important. Being a prince was something that had happened to him through an accident of birth and circumstance. Being a doctor was something he had chosen to become through hard work and commitment to serving others. The question wasn't whether he was worthy of being a prince. The question was whether the monarchy was worthy of him. As he stabilized a patient, who reminded him of his mother, a nurse who had been injured while helping others, Alexander made a decision. He would meet with his father. Not as a supplicant seeking acknowledgement, but as an equal seeking answers. He would demand to know why Charles had never fought for the right to be part of his life, why the royal family had been more important than the son who had been hidden away. But first he needed to understand exactly what he would be walking into. The royal family in the 21st century was a complex institution, balancing tradition with modernity, public service with private happiness. If Alexander was going to claim his place in that world, he needed to do it on his own terms with full knowledge of the cost and benefits. The little boy who had grown up wondering about his father was about to demand answers from the King of England. And nothing in the carefully ordered world of royal protocol had prepared anyone for that conversation. Thomas Mitchell's hands trembled as he dialed the number he had memorized but never used. After delivering the Queen's letter to Alexander, he had spent sleepless nights wondering if he had made the right choice. The weight of 30 years of loyal service pressed against his conscience as he listened to the phone ring in what he knew was the King's private study at Clarence House. "Your Majesty," Thomas said when Charles answered, his voice barely steady. "This is Captain Thomas Mitchell. I served as your mother's personal guard for over 3 decades. Charles's voice was warm but puzzled. "Of course, Captain Mitchell. Mother spoke of you often. How can I help you?" "Sir, I need to request an immediate private audience. It concerns a matter that your mother asked me to handle after her death. A matter involving someone very close to you." The line was quiet for a long moment. Charles had learned to read between the lines of carefully worded requests during his decades as heir to the throne. Something in Thomas's tone suggested this was far more serious than a routine matter of settling the late Queen's affairs. "Can you give me any indication of what this concerns?" Charles asked carefully. Thomas closed his eyes, knowing that his next words would set in motion events that could reshape the monarchy. "It concerns your son, Your Majesty. Your eldest son. William is in Scotland with his family. If there's some security concern—" "Not Prince William, sir," Thomas interrupted gently. "Your other son, the one you've never met." The silence that followed was so complete that Thomas wondered if the line had gone dead. When Charles finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "Where did you get this information?" "From your mother, sir. She entrusted me with documents and asked me to act on them if she passed away without resolving the situation herself. That time has come." Charles's breathing was audible through the phone. "How much do you know?" "Everything, Your Majesty. Sarah Whitmore, the birth in 1979, the arrangements made for the child's care, the financial support provided through the trust fund, and I know that Dr. Alexander Whitmore is now aware of his heritage." The intake of breath was sharp and pained. "He knows." "As of 1 week ago, yes, sir. I delivered your mother's letter to him personally, along with all the supporting documentation she had preserved." Charles was quiet for several minutes. Thomas could hear movement in the background, the sound of a chair creaking, footsteps on a hardwood floor. When the king finally spoke again, his voice carried the weight of 36 years of suppressed grief and regret. "What does he want?" "I believe he wants to meet you, sir. But he wants to meet you as his father, not as his sovereign. He has questions that only you can answer. And if word of this gets out, if the press discovers that I have a secret son who's been hidden for over 3 decades, The constitutional implications alone could trigger a crisis. Thomas had expected this response. The royal family's first instinct was always to protect the institution, even at the cost of personal happiness. But he had also spent enough time with the late Queen to understand the toll that institutional thinking could take on individual souls. With respect, Your Majesty, Dr. Whitmore has had a week to contact the press if that was his intention. He's had access to documents and photographs that would be worth millions to the right tabloid. Instead, he's continued working at the hospital and has told only his longtime partner about his discovery. His partner? Dr. Emma Richardson. They've been together for 3 years and are engaged to be married. By all accounts, she's a remarkable woman who shares his commitment to medical service. Charles absorbed this information slowly. Somewhere out there was a son he had never properly met. A man who had grown up to become everything Charles had hoped he might be, and that son was planning to marry a woman who knew nothing about royal protocol or the pressures of public life. What kind of man is he? Charles asked quietly. Thomas smiled for the first time in days. He's exactly the kind of man you and Sarah raised him to be, even from a distance. He's dedicated his life to helping others. He's respected by his colleagues. He volunteers for charities in his spare time. He's never sought attention or recognition for himself. In many ways, sir, he embodies the best qualities of both his parents. Does he look like you, sir? Very much like you. The resemblance is quite striking, actually. I'm surprised no one has ever commented on it. Charles walked to his desk and opened the locked drawer where he kept the photographs and reports about Alexander that his mother had shared with him over the years. The most recent one showed Alexander at a medical conference, receiving an award for his work with underprivileged patients. Charles had studied that photograph countless times, memorizing every detail of the son he had never been able to acknowledge. Captain Mitchell, Charles said finally, I need to ask you about the security implications of this situation. If Alexander decides to go public with his heritage, what kind of protection would he need? That's one of the things he wants to discuss with you, sir. He's lived his entire life as a private citizen. He has no understanding of the security protocols that would be necessary if he acknowledged his royal status. But I should warn you, Your Majesty, that he's not seeking your permission or approval. He's seeking a conversation between a father and son who have been kept apart by circumstances beyond their control. Charles set down the photograph and walked to the window overlooking the gardens where he had often played as a child. What did my mother's letter say to him? That you loved him from the day he was born, sir. That you followed his progress throughout his life and have been proud of every accomplishment. That the decisions made about his upbringing were made with love, even though they might not seem that way to him now. And what did he say when he read that? Thomas hesitated. He said that love without action is just sentiment, sir. He said that if you truly loved him, you would have found a way to be part of his life regardless of the constitutional implications. The words hit Charles like physical blows. They were harsh but not unfair, coming from a son who had grown up believing his father was dead. Alexander had no context for understanding the impossible position Charles had been in as heir to the throne. The way duty and personal desire had warred with each other every day for decades. When does he want to meet? Charles asked. As soon as you're willing to see him, sir. But he's requested that the meeting take place somewhere private, away from the palace. He doesn't want to feel like he's approaching the throne as a supplicant. He wants to meet you as his father first, and as his sovereign only if and when he chooses to acknowledge that relationship publicly. Charles understood the request completely. Alexander wanted to level the playing field, to meet as equals before addressing the vast difference in their public positions. It was a reasonable request from a man who had every right to be angry about the circumstances of his birth and upbringing. Tell him that I'll meet him anywhere he chooses, Charles said. And Captain Mitchell? Tell him that there hasn't been a day in the past 36 years that I haven't thought about him and wondered what kind of man he was becoming. Tell him that his father has been proud of him since the moment he was born. After ending the call, Charles sat alone in his study, surrounded by the official portraits and ceremonial objects that defined his public life. But his eyes were fixed on the small collection of photographs and reports that represented his private grief. The son he had loved but never known. The family that circumstances had forced him to abandon. Tomorrow, he would finally meet the child he had held once as a newborn, and then never seen again. The conversation would either heal a wound that had festered for decades, or it would create new pain that might never fully heal. But for the first time in 36 years, King Charles III would have the chance to tell his eldest son that he loved him. And perhaps if Alexander could find it in his heart to forgive the choices that duty had forced upon them both, they might finally have the relationship that had been stolen from them by the demands of the crown. The abandoned church in Kent had been closed for over a decade, its Gothic windows boarded up and its grounds overgrown with wild brambles. It was the perfect place for a conversation that couldn't happen anywhere else in the world. A meeting between the King of England and the son whose existence he had never officially acknowledged. Alexander arrived first, his hands shaking as he pushed open the heavy wooden door. The interior was dusty and cold, shafts of late afternoon sunlight filtering through cracks in the boarded windows. He had chosen this location carefully, isolated enough to avoid prying eyes, but neutral territory where neither man would have the advantage of familiar surroundings. He heard the car approaching long before he saw it. The engine sound was different from ordinary vehicles, heavier and more deliberate. Through a gap in the boards, Alexander watched as a black Range Rover pulled up, followed by a second vehicle carrying what were obviously security personnel. Even for this most private of meetings, the King of England couldn't travel alone. The man who walked through the church door looked older than Alexander had expected, his shoulders slightly bowed by the weight of recent grief and sudden kingship. But there was no mistaking the resemblance that Thomas had mentioned. They shared the same jawline, the same deep-set eyes, the same way of holding their heads when deep in thought. For a long moment, father and son simply stared at each other across the empty church. Charles's eyes filled with tears as he took in the sight of the man Alexander had become, tall and lean like his father, but with Sarah's gentle expression and compassionate eyes. Every photograph Charles had treasured over the years paled in comparison to seeing his son in person. "You look just like your mother," Charles said softly, his voice echoing in the empty space. "So I've been told," Alexander replied, his tone carefully neutral. "Though I'm told I have your stubborn streak." Charles smiled through his tears. "Sarah used to say that too. She said you got my determination but her common sense, which was probably the better combination." The mention of Sarah's name created a bridge between them. She was the one person they had both loved, the one connection that couldn't be denied or minimized by protocol and politics. "She never told me," Alexander said, his voice carrying 36 years of accumulated pain. "My entire childhood I asked about my father, and she told me he was a soldier who died before I was born. I used to make up stories about him, imagine what he was like, wonder if he would have been proud of me." Charles's composure cracked. "He would have been. I have been. Every report card, every achievement, every time you helped someone or made a difference in the world, I was proud of you." "But you were never there," Alexander replied, his voice rising. "You were never at my school plays or my graduation or when I broke my arm learning to ride the bicycle that mysteriously appeared on my birthday. You were proud of me from a distance, like I was some sort of interesting experiment you were observing." "That's not how it was," Charles said desperately. "I wanted to be there. I wanted to teach you to ride that bicycle, to help you with your homework, to be at your graduation cheering louder than anyone else. But I couldn't risk the scandal it would have caused. The monarchy was fragile in those days, and any hint of impropriety could have brought down the entire system. So the system was more important than your son?" The question hung in the air like incense from long-forgotten services. Charles walked closer, close enough that Alexander could see the pain etched in every line of his father's face. "No," Charles said quietly, "but I was 29 years old and terrified. I had been raised to believe that duty came before everything else, including personal happiness. I made a choice that I've regretted every day since, but I made it because I thought it was best for everyone involved, including you." "Best for me?" Alexander's voice was bitter. "Growing up without a father was best for me. Watching my mother cry herself to sleep was best for me. Living my entire life wondering who I really was and where I came from was best for me." Charles reached out as if to touch his son's shoulder, then let his hand fall. "Your mother never told you about our meetings?" Alexander frowned. "What meetings?" "We saw each other regularly throughout your childhood. Not often enough, never long enough, but Sarah would bring you to parks where I could watch you play. She would send me photographs and videos of your school events. When you were sick, she would call me with updates on your recovery." The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. "You were there? You watched me and never said anything?" I was at your rugby match when you scored the winning try in your final year at Oxford. I was in the hospital waiting room when you had your appendix surgery. I was standing in the back of the auditorium when you graduated from medical school. Charles's voice broke. I've been watching you your entire life, Alexander. I've been loving you from a distance because that was the only way I was allowed to love you. Alexander sank onto one of the dusty pews, the weight of these revelations overwhelming him. Why didn't she tell me? Because we agreed that it would be harder for you to know I was there, but couldn't acknowledge you. We thought it would be kinder for you to believe I was dead, rather than to know that your living father was choosing not to be part of your life. And was it kinder? Charles sat down beside his son, careful to maintain some distance but close enough that Alexander could feel his presence. I don't know. I've asked myself that question 10,000 times. All I know is that every choice we made was motivated by love, even when it caused pain. They sat in silence for several minutes, both men processing decades of misunderstanding and missed opportunities. Outside, the late afternoon was giving way to evening, and somewhere in the distance, church bells from a functioning parish were calling people to evening service. What happens now? Alexander asked finally. That depends on what you want, Charles replied. You can continue living your life as Dr. Alexander Whitmore, and I'll respect that choice completely. Or you can acknowledge your heritage and take your place in the royal family, with all the privileges and responsibilities that entails. And if I choose the latter? Charles took a deep breath. Then you'll be third in line to the throne ahead of your Uncle Edward and your Aunt Anne. You'll need to learn royal protocol, take on official duties, submit to security protection. Your relationship with Emma will be scrutinized by the press and the public. Your entire life will become public property. What would you choose if you were in my position? Charles smiled sadly. If I were in your position, I would probably choose the quiet life. You've built something meaningful as a doctor, something that makes a real difference in people's lives. The royal family serves an important function, but it's not always a fulfilling life. Alexander studied his father's face, seeing the toll that a lifetime of duty had taken. Do you ever regret it? Being king? I regret missing your childhood, Charles said without hesitation. I regret that duty kept me from being the father you deserved. But I don't regret serving my country, and I hope that my service has made some difference in the world. What did my mother want? In the end, what did she think I should do? Charles's eyes grew distant. She wanted you to have the choice that we never had. She wanted you to decide for yourself whether royal duty was worth the sacrifices it requires, and she wanted you to know that whatever you choose, you are loved. As darkness fell around the abandoned church, both men knew that their conversation was nearing its end. They had begun to bridge the gap that 36 years of separation had created, but healing would take time. I need to think about this, Alexander said finally. Of course, take all the time you need, but Alexander... Charles stood up, his formal bearing returning as he prepared to leave. Whatever you decide about your public role, I hope you'll allow me to be part of your private life. I've missed enough birthdays and holidays and important moments. I don't want to miss any more. For the first time since entering the church, Alexander smiled. I'd like that. But I have one condition. Anything. Next time we meet somewhere with better heating. I'm freezing. Charles laughed, and for a moment the sound echoed through the abandoned church like a prayer for second chances and healing grace. Father and son walked toward the door together, their shadows stretching behind them like the long reach of history itself. 6 months later, Alexander stood in the same hospital where his mother had once worked, preparing for what would be either his last shift as an anonymous doctor or his final day before becoming one of the most famous people in Britain. The decision that had consumed his thoughts since that meeting in the abandoned church had finally crystallized into a plan that surprised even him. Emma found him in the break room, staring at a newspaper whose headlines screamed about the latest royal scandal involving a distant cousin's divorce. Second thoughts? She asked gently. Alexander shook his head. No second thoughts. But I keep thinking about what we're about to walk into. Once I make this announcement, we can never go back to being ordinary people. We were never ordinary people, Alex. We were just people who didn't know how extraordinary we really were. Over the past months, Alexander had quietly met with his father several more times, always in private locations chosen for their discretion. They had begun to build the relationship that should have existed for 36 years. sharing stories about their lives, their hopes, and their understanding of duty and service. Charles had introduced Alexander to his half-brothers William and Harry during a private dinner at Highgrove House. The meeting had been emotional and complicated, with William initially struggling to understand how his father could have kept such a monumental secret, while Harry had been more immediately accepting, perhaps understanding from his own experience what it meant to live outside traditional royal expectations. "You're sure about how you want to do this?" Emma asked, checking her watch. The press conference was scheduled for 2 p.m., just after Alexander's shift ended. "I'm sure," Alexander replied firmly. "I've thought about this from every angle, and this is the only way that feels authentic to who I am." The hospital's main conference room had been transformed into a media circus. Representatives from every major news outlet in Britain and many international organizations crowded into the space, their cameras and microphones creating a forest of technology pointed toward the simple podium where Alexander would make his announcement. At exactly 2 p.m., Alexander walked into the room wearing his hospital scrubs, having deliberately chosen not to change into formal attire. Emma stood beside him looking nervous but determined. Thomas Mitchell, now officially serving as Alexander's private secretary, occupied a chair in the front row, his weathered face reflecting both pride and concern. "Good afternoon," Alexander began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. "My name is Dr. Alexander Whitmore, and I am a consultant in emergency medicine here at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. I've called this press conference to share information about my family background that was previously unknown to me and has never been made public." The room was dead silent, every reporter sensing that they were about to witness something unprecedented. 6 months ago, I learned that my biological father is King Charles III. I am his eldest son, born in 1979 to my mother Sarah Whitmore, who was then a nurse at St. Mary's Hospital. This information was kept secret at the request of the late Queen Elizabeth II and my mother, who believed that privacy was in everyone's best interest at the time. The explosion of questions and camera flashes that followed was immediate and overwhelming. Alexander waited for the noise to die down before continuing. "I want to be clear about several things. First, I was not seeking this information, nor did I have any knowledge of my heritage until it was revealed to me by a former royal guard, acting on the instructions of the late Queen. Second, His Majesty the King was not aware that I had been informed of my parentage until I requested a meeting with him through proper channels." A reporter shouted out, "Are you claiming the throne? What does this mean for the line of succession?" Alexander held up his hand for quiet. "That brings me to the most important point I want to make today. After careful consideration and extensive consultation with His Majesty, I have decided to formally acknowledge my heritage and take my place in the line of succession as the King's eldest son. However, I will be doing so in a way that reflects both royal tradition and my personal commitment to public service." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room. "I will retain my position as a practicing physician and continue my work at this hospital. I will take on royal duties and patronages that complement my medical career, focusing particularly on healthcare initiatives, medical research, and support for NHS workers. I will not be accepting a royal salary or living in royal residences. Instead, I will continue to live as a private citizen who happens to be a member of the royal family." The questions came rapid fire now, reporters struggling to understand how someone could be a prince and a working doctor simultaneously. "Dr. Whitmore," called out a journalist from the Times, "how does the palace feel about your decision to maintain your medical career while serving as a royal?" "His Majesty has been extraordinarily supportive of my decision to combine royal duties with my medical practice. We both believe that the monarchy is strongest when it reflects the values and experiences of the people it serves. My work as a doctor has given me insights into the challenges facing ordinary British families that I believe will inform my royal duties." "What about your personal life?" another reporter demanded. "Will you be getting married? Will your children be in line for the throne?" Alexander smiled and took Emma's hand. "Dr. Emma Richardson and I will be married next month in a private ceremony. We've been together for over 3 years, and she has my complete admiration for her willingness to take on the challenges that come with marrying into the royal family. As for children, any children we have will be in the line of succession according to the established laws of primogeniture." A tabloid reporter pushed forward aggressively. "How can we be sure you're really the king's son? What proof do you have?" Thomas Mitchell stood up from his front row seat, his bearing still military straight despite his age. "The documentation proving Dr. Whitmore's parentage has been verified by the Crown's legal advisors and includes DNA evidence gathered during his childhood. His Majesty acknowledged paternity through his private secretary yesterday, and Buckingham Palace will be issuing a formal statement within the hour." The questions continued for nearly 2 hours, covering everything from Alexander's political views to his opinion on the future of the monarchy. Throughout it all, he remained calm and thoughtful, treating each question with the same careful attention he gave to medical diagnoses. As the press conference finally wound down, Alexander made one final statement. "I want to say something directly to the British people who are watching this. I know that this revelation raises questions about transparency, royal prerogative, and the institution of monarchy itself. These are fair questions that deserve honest answers. What I can tell you is that I have spent my entire adult life in service to others, and I intend to continue that service whether I'm wearing a stethoscope or carrying out royal engagements. I didn't ask to be born into the royal family, but I'm honored by the opportunity to serve. I hope to earn your respect through my actions, rather than demanding it through my title. And I promise you this: I will never ask you to accept me as your prince simply because of who my father is. I will ask you to judge me based on how I use whatever platform I've been given to make a positive difference in your lives." As Alexander and Emma left the hospital that evening, walking hand in hand through the crowd of photographers and well-wishers who had gathered outside, they both knew that their quiet life was officially over, but they also knew that they were embarking on something unprecedented, a royal role defined not by ceremony and tradition alone, but by genuine public service and authentic connection to the people they would serve. The secret that had haunted 3 generations was finally in the open. King Charles III had acknowledged his eldest son, the line of succession had been quietly but permanently altered, and the British monarchy had gained a member who understood both the weight of the crown and the struggles of ordinary citizens. In the abandoned church in Kent where father and son had first met, a small plaque would soon be installed commemorating the conversation that changed the royal family forever. It would read simply, "In this place love triumphed over duty, and a father found his son." The hidden prince was hidden no more, and the monarchy would never be quite the same again.